It's recording. So let's see. We spoke about the how the Dutch started changing their names. I mean, you were telling me on the phone. You had some thoughts about that.
Yeah, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Dutch naming customs. You know, when our Dutch ancestors arrived over here in the 17th century, they used a patronymic naming system. It was kind of a Germanic, medieval type system which they still used. And in that system, there was no surname for the family. A man's last name came from his father's first name. So for example, Jan, son of Peter, was Jan Peters. But if he named his son Peter after his father, then his son would be Peter Jans or Peter Janssen. So the last name changed with every generation. And the names could be based also on their nickname instead of their first name. The Dutch had a different way of making nicknames than the English. The English nicknames are customarily made from the first part of the name. For example, Christopher, the nickname is Chris. Well, in Dutch, it's taken from the latter part of the name. So in Dutch, the name for Christopher is Stouffer. That's the nickname. And for Matthew, in English, it's Matt. But the Dutch for Matthias is Thijs. And so a man could have the nickname Thijs, and his son might have the last name Tyson. So a man who had 4 sons, each of the sons would have the same last name, but the first cousins, the next generation, would all have different names based on their father's name. So you couldn't tell that they were cousins by their last name, nor could you tell that other people in the town that had the same last name as them were not related at all. And this drove the English crazy. So the English demanded that the Dutch take non-changing last names. So almost all the van type names that you hear are actually American names that Dutch families assumed in America at the demand of the English. And they indicate where the family came from in Holland. Not everybody took that kind of name. Some, in fact, just froze their patronymic name, so it stayed the same from generation to generation. And some took names based on their trade. But the Vans were all names that were assumed here because the English demanded it. Now, a little later, when we had the American Revolution, at that time, it became popular among the Dutch to anglicize their names. And this took a lot of different forms. Sometimes, if they had a name that was based on their trade, like Schmidt, they became Smith. Colonel Frelinghuysen, which is a well-known Dutch name, he was called Freelinghuis. A lot of the Van names dropped the Van. The Van Covenhoven family, a large number of them, just assumed the name Conover. So if you see a Conover, that goes back to Van Covenhoven. And so those are some of the things that you need to know if you're ever going to do any family history of a Dutch family. It becomes difficult.
You hit it right on the head with all that. That's perfect.
Okay.
Now, and that'll fit perfect into the...
Call from 609-207.
Good thing that happened then. Let me shut it off.
Did I cover all the points you wanted to cover?
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
Okay, was it too long?
No, that's perfect. You hit it right on the head there with that. Because it's funny is that in the narration that I've been writing, I touch upon that, exactly what you say. And one of the original genealogists, who is actually a descendant of that Captain Johannes Van Etten, I think I sent you one of those links to the page I made, is this Leslie Van Etten, and he mentions some of what you exactly said there.
Okay.
So having this narration and then cut to a video of somebody like yourself speaking of what we just spoke
Good.
about.
Right.
It's going to really look like a Ken Burns documentary.
All right, get
So-
some music to play there.
Well, that's another little project. I'm trying to find somebody who could do some, like simple violin type of music or period music, Now, this is still rolling, and I could just edit out all this stuff in the middle. But can you speak of the families that started the Dutch Reformed Church? And do you know much about that history of the church and moving from Branchburg?
Well, in the very early days, in the very early part of the 1700s, there was no church. And the people keenly felt the lack of good Christian teaching, especially for their children. And so they sent to Holland for a minister, and they got Theodore Frelinghuysen. And he came with his brother-in-law named Schuurman. And Schuurman was a teacher in the school. So there was a church and a school. The people, most of them came here from up around Albany. And that was because this area had been a continuously occupied Indian settlement for over 7,000 years. It was the crossing of the North and the South Branch rivers and two main Indian trails right at this point. So it was a trading center and a permanent settlement for a long time. And the Dutch, who, different from the English in a way, were more inclined to fur trading rather than farming it early on. And so they settled up in Albany to do fur trading, and some of these fur traders came down here to trade with these Indians in this permanent settlement. And they bought a little bit of land from the Indians right at that point where the church was, and they established a trading post about 1680. And so it was their influence, since they came from Albany, their influence drew other settlers from Albany when the land became available.
Okay. So Emmanuel Van Etten came from Esopus, so that just being south of Albany, I guess it drew everybody from up
Yes.
along the Hudson River.
That's right.
So, of course, as I told you, I first learned about Emmanuel through actually the same Leslie Van Etten, who wrote a book from back in the 70s and 80s. And I had always wondered why we saw these writings of the Venatas coming from Raritan. Yet I always had this mindset they came down along the old mine road.
Mhm.
Well, maybe some of them did, because a lot of them, when tracing their births, it shows that they were born in Sussex County, and then the next jump going backwards was to Esopus, Kingston area. Yet this one branch of Emmanuel, his children were born in this area,
Yeah.
in Somerset County. So some took this path and some took this path, and then they wound up meeting in Sussex County,
Yes,
later
it's-
Warren
It's
County.
amazing, yeah.
So, I just wanted to see what more you could say about, Emmanuel Van Etten and the Van Fleets who bought his property. Do you know much about those families?
I'm afraid I don't know
You
much
don't?
about
Okay.
them,
Okay.
unfortunately.
I think that, what's the name of the girl?
Stephanie Stevens.
She would know more, right?
She probably would.
I haven't reached out to her, but when I get done with you, I'm going home, and I'm going to do that very soon. Maybe I could get her involved in
Yeah,
this a little
I
bit.
think she'd be a good one for you to talk to.
Yeah, yeah,
on
'cause-
that.
yeah, on that subject. But that first part is perfect.
Okay, thanks.
And I think that's pretty much it, unless there's anything else you think you can add to the history of the area. I don't know. Is there anything else you think you can add? Or?
Well, there's a lot of stuff I know about the history of the area, but
Yeah, I mean,
ramble
it-
on. So
Yeah, no, but pertaining to like the Dutch, if there's anything that jumps out of your head. I find it always interesting when I go through books, and I could be looking for Venata stuff or Van Etten stuff, but then I find something that how it relates to the Dutch.
Mhm.
Like the name changing. I actually read that even before seeing Leslie's book
yeah.
and some other book about history.
Mhm.
So again, if there's anything that
Well, you're aware, of course, that the old log church called the Church Over the North Branch, that was also a school, is actually the earliest ancestor of Rutgers University. And one of the things that was very central to the American Revolution as far as New Jersey is concerned is a split in the Dutch Reformed Church that occurred because some of the people felt that all their ministers had to be trained in Holland, and some felt that they could establish a school here and train ministers in America. And so the people that felt that way were the ones that formed Queens College as a seminary, which became Rutgers. And those people tended to become patriots. And all around this area, the churches were from that particular faction of the Dutch Reformed Church. And the ones that felt that they had to have ministers from Holland, they tended to become loyalists. So this area was very strongly patriot during the American Revolution. But for example, up in Bergen County, the Dutch church was split between the two factions, and it was a very bitter civil war in Bergen County during the American Revolution. But here it was a safe area because just about everybody was a patriot from the faction that felt that we could educate our ministers here. And they felt more American.
Okay. That's perfect, and we spoke about that. You know, on a side note, and maybe you could confirm this, but somebody told me when I went to this one presentation I was telling you about up in about Old Mine Road, that the Dutch were actually supplying military equipment to the Patriots. Have you heard about that? About the Dutch sending rifles?
Oh, from Holland.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yes, the Dutch did, and also the French before the alliance. I mean, before there was actually an alliance, both countries were sending armaments over here surreptitiously.
Okay.
And, yeah, that was very important to us because we had very few people who were capable of making a musket in those days. So we basically had to rely on what they already had.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty much what I thought, so they confirmed it at that presentation. So I think that's perfect. What I got here is it's not that long, and it'll fit right into a couple themes of Emmanuel and his family coming into this area. So
Okay, great.
That's all I really needed. That's perfect.
All right, Bill, I'm happy. That's good.
That's great. See, I told you it wasn't going to take too long.